Okay, this is the next lesson in the industrial medicine scheme of learning. And what we're going to look at in this lesson is the prevention of disease in the year 1700 to 1900. Now, to do this, we're going to look at twofold. We're going to look at vaccinations and how they developed after the work of Edward Jenner. And we're also going to look at the role of the government and public health, because this will be really important to develop our understanding of how the government began to get involved in this time period. So if you have a look at this Edexcel scheme of learning specification, we've done a lesson on the germ theory and Robert Koch's work on microbes. We've looked at the role of Nightingale, treatment, Simpson, Lister. You've had a lesson on Jenner, and now we're just going to go back and look at the approaches to prevention, looking at the development and the use of vaccinations, which means we'll start looking at, go back to looking at Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, and then look at the Public Health Acts. Then we're not just going to look at the 1875 Public Health Act. We're going to go through how the government began to lose their laissez-faire attitude and develop how they got more involved in the public health of the population. So this is something that's a bit more developmental, that's something that really goes a bit unnoticed in the course. The fact that after Edward Jenner, now remember, when we looked at Edward Jenner, we came to the conclusion, or came across the suggestion, that Edward Jenner's work might have only been a one-off because of the way in which he found it. Now, Edward Jenner's work was taken one step further after we start finding out about germs in 1861. So following the work of Jenner, it inspired more scientists to do everything they can and could to develop the idea of vaccinations. And Louis Pasteur had a clear role in developing this. Now, as we know, Louis Pasteur presented the concept of germ theory in 1861 and germ theory for infection in 1878. And he came to the conclusion that microorganisms were responsible for disease. Now, Louis Pasteur was very significant as he admired the work of Edward Jenner. And what he did was he began to look for vaccines. However, what was the problem that Louis Pasteur faced was that Jenner's work was more about observing people's symptoms rather than actually tackling a germ. Okay, when Jenner was finding his vaccination, he had no idea that the germ that was causing smallpox. He just knew that, or he observed that milkmaids were not getting it because they'd had cowpox. But because Louis Pasteur was living in a different time, he now knew that there were things causing these diseases. So Pasteur realized that a germ could only be attacked once it had been identified. So the difference with Louis Pasteur is that he focused his vaccinations on animal diseases. And his first effort for this was trying to find a vaccination for chicken cholera in 1879. And he worked out that a weakened strain of the disease worked to vaccinate the chickens. So by giving them a weakened version of the disease, it meant that they didn't catch the main disease, which is very similar to the concept of the flu jab that we have today, in which our body creates antibodies which prevents the person from suffering a bigger dosage of a disease. So Louis Pasteur started with chicken cholera, and then he continued his work and found a vaccine for anthrax, which was another disease that impacted animals, and also rabies. Now, even though Louis Pasteur's work was just on animals, the concept of making a weakened version of the culture of the germ and then treating people with it was something that was a big turning point. The reason for this was because it created an immune response where the body fights off the weakened disease and creates antibodies that prevent the person from getting the main disease. So this is the concept of a vaccine today. You're given a weakened dosage of the disease and your body is strong enough to fight back. Now, the thing is, Pasteur didn't know this because technology wasn't advanced, but the method did work. Again, the problem though is that Pasteur's work was only on animals, but it did inspire other scientists to begin developing vaccination for human usage. Now, Robert Koch also had a role to play in development of vaccines because he isolated the germ and he identified certain germs for certain diseases. And by doing this, he was able to develop further vaccines or help people develop further vaccines. So in 1890, Behring found a vaccine for tetanus and diphtheria. And the reason they were able to do this was because of Robert Koch's role in isolating the germ and identifying the germ for certain diseases. And by 1900, scientists were very busy isolating germs using Robert Koch's method and developing vaccines using the method of Louis Pasteur, and also the idea that was started by Edward Jenner. So there's two tasks here. Number one, write a paragraph explaining how vaccines developed in the years 1800 to 1900. And then number two, who do you think was more important in vaccine development after Jenner? Did Louis Pasteur have a bigger role, or was it the role of Robert Koch? Really think about who took on the role more effectively. You know, I would possibly argue that, yes, Louis Pasteur helped development of vaccines as he identified the immune response, but without the isolation of the microorganism that Robert Koch did, maybe we wouldn't have advanced as quickly, but then that's up to you to decide. So if you have a look through this information again, pause the video and do those two questions in as much detail as possible, and then we're ready to move on to look at the government response of health and look at how they help prevent illness. Right, now, the next thing we need to look at is the public health in England in the years 1842 to 1875. Now, by public health, we mean obviously living conditions. Now, alongside the scientific methods, the vaccine developments, a lot more was done to improve living conditions in Britain. Now, what needs to be understood is that Britain was going through this industrial revolution at this stage, which means that there were more people living there, and it meant that the government might have needed to get involved. Now, in 1700, the government had a laissez-faire attitude, which meant they didn't think it was their job to get involved in people's lives. And they only really got involved if they had to. So they let people get on with it. Laissez-faire means sort of leave it be. So unless they had to get involved, people lived their own lives. But by the 1800s, this had to change because more men had the right to vote. So by 1832, the government had passed something called the Great Reform Act, which gave more people the right to vote. And to stay in power, the government needed to pass laws to keep people happy. Now, these laws also included public health, improving the lives of the people, because there were lots of different things that were making life difficult for people in England. And one of the biggest ones was cholera, which meant the government had to get involved to improve living conditions for the people. And if people weren't happy, then a lot of men could actually now vote against the government to vote them out of power. So how did public health develop in this time period? Now, there's four strands. Obviously, the exam board specification talks about the Second Public Health Act. But first of all, you need to understand the work of Edwin Chadwick. Then look at the First Public Health Act. Look at how the government got involved in the 1860s. And then the Second Public Health Act. Now, in the next lesson that's going to be recorded, we're going to do a little bit on John Snow. Now, what needs to be understood is that this wasn't just the government. You also had people pushing the government to make change, such as John Snow, which we'll talk about in the John Snow lesson. So, this is a breakdown of the developments in public health. Now, you've got Edwin Chadwick, who in 1842 published a report called Report on Sanitary Conditions, and he said that people in the cities had a lower life expectancy. Well, that's obvious in those days because more people lived in the cities, you know, the big cities that were becoming industrialized, so they were going to have a lower life expectancy, but that's because the living conditions were very poor. They lived in poor housing, there was not a proper sewage system, and disease was very common. Now, Edwin Chadwick said that it was down to the filthy conditions, and what he wanted was for all cities to set up a board of health who would be responsible for supplying clean water and disposing of sewage. Now, the reason I put a sad face next to Edwin Chadwick is because he didn't have much impact. For Edwin Chadwick to be successful, he needed more evidence to support his theory. He got people thinking about it, but people didn't take it seriously because he didn't have enough evidence to support his theory. This is like a common theme in some of this course, is that unless you've got a solid, concrete evidence, it's very difficult to believe it. So then we go on to the First Public Health Act of 1848, and the aim of the First Public Health Act was to improve the sanitary conditions of towns in England and Wales. Now, the key word there in that second little paragraph is that the government asked cities to set up boards of health. The problem was, It was not compulsory. They were asked, they weren't told. So areas, different cities ignored it, mainly because they couldn't afford it or they didn't see it as high in their agenda. Now, the key thing is, look at the two dates, 1842 and 1848. By this time, we didn't have an understanding of germs. So it was something that still didn't have enough evidential proof to be able to go ahead and take it seriously. Then you've got the next stage. Now, government intervention, this can be argued that it's also down to John Snow and Louis Pasteur. But in 1858, the government gave in and paid £3 million for a sewage system in London after the Great Stink. Now, the Great Stink was an event where the Thames basically evaporated and the heat rotted the waste that was inside the Thames, and it literally stunk out government, and they knew they had to make changes instead of people just dumping their waste in the nearest water supply. Now, Louis Pasteur had a huge impact in 1861 by identifying germs, and it led to a situation of changes. So by 1865, London had 1,300 miles of sewer. You had an individual called Joseph Bazalgette that completed this. And then also across the country, you also had areas like Birmingham, where they destroyed their slums. And in Leeds, local businesses obtained a court order to prevent sewage from being drained into the rivers. So the government was having more impact in making sure that cities were changing, but it wasn't quick enough. So by 1875, the government introduced the Second Public Health Act, which was a compulsory policy, which meant that the city authorities had a responsibility to provide many things. Now, I've put 6 things here, but there were a lot more to this. So, firstly, provide clean water, dispose of sewage to prevent cholera, build public toilets, ensure housing was of better quality, providing parks for exercise, and checking the quality of food in the shops to make sure it didn't contain anything that could cause harm. Now, this was really important as it meant that everyone had a part to play in developing public health. And it led to significant, it led to boards of health being created, and it meant that city authorities were responsible for their own health, which meant that life expectancy went up. It meant the streets were no longer ravaged with dirt and waste. And it meant that the government were now fully invested in ensuring that people stayed alive. So here's a little task that you can complete. You've got here, if you had a question like this, you could use this is your evidence and this is your explanation. So what the 1875 Public Health Act did, and then why would this help prevent the illness? So public toilets were built. Straight away you could talk about how this would prevent people from throwing their waste out the window, from their waste being collected in their homes. The fact that public toilets were built meant that there was a place where everyone could just go to the toilet without doing it on the street, which means disease is not going to spread as quickly. This is a really strong task that you can do to be able to develop your idea of explanation, which is absolutely key to the overall development of your writing. Okay, so pause the video, write out the statements, and then say this would help prevent illness because. You pause the video here, and then I'll just spend a couple of minutes going through it. Right, so if we just quickly go through these statements and come to a conclusion about why they would help prevent illness. So setting up boards of health that had the responsibility to look after the health of people, it was compulsory. The fact it was compulsory is a huge reason for prevention. It meant the government were losing their laissez-faire attitude and enforced policy onto local boards of health. It's going to put more responsibility, and the government in turn there would want success. So it gives that local responsibility to ensure that the public are looked after and their health is number one priority. Public toilets were built. We mentioned, I've already gone through that one just before we started this. Sewage system was built. Now, the fact that there was less waste going into the water system means that epidemics such as cholera were not going to be a problem. Okay, clean water must be provided, very similar about cholera. Housing was a better quality and not squashed together. Well, it means that if disease did happen, that the overall spread would be a lot slower. And living conditions are important for both mental and physical health. And providing park for exercise. I mean, regular exercise equals better health. So you can definitely develop that concept. Okay. Now, the last thing you can do as a little bit of a revision activity is you can write a paragraph on vaccines and Public Health Act, explain why there was rapid change in the prevention of disease in the industrial period. The last paragraph, you could definitely talk about Jon Snow, and then you can use the next lesson we do on this to help you.